Compensation plan design is one of the most consequential decisions a CS leader makes, and one of the least discussed. Most CS leaders spend significant time thinking about their team's operating rhythm, their coaching approach, their org structure. And then when it comes to comp, they either inherit something they didn't design, borrow from a sales framework that doesn't quite fit, or build something from scratch without a clear philosophy to anchor it. And the cost of getting it wrong is real, not just in dollars, in behavior, because your comp plan is one of the loudest signals you send your team about what actually matters. It tells your CSMs what to prioritize, what to protect, and what to go after. When the plan is well designed, it aligns individual incentive with company outcomes. When it isn't, your team optimizes for what the plan rewards. And that may not be what you actually need. Today, we're building a framework for CS comp design from the ground up. What the philosophy should be, how structure changes based on what your team owns, and what base versus variable should look like across different CS models. Stick around because at the end, I'll share where the judgment calls in comp design get hard and where having a thinking partner changes the outcome. Welcome to the CS RevSpeak podcast. I'm Angeline Gavino. I spent 17 years leading customer success inside B2B SaaS, most recently as a VP of CS. And today, I coach customer success leaders one-on-one on the exact challenges you're navigating right now. Everything I share in this podcast comes from time actually doing the work and time spent helping other leaders lead better. I talk about building credibility, turning customer success into a revenue engine, scaling your team, and navigating the leadership challenges nobody prepares you for. Let's dive into today's episode. Before we talk about numbers, metrics, or structures, we need to talk about philosophy, because the most common comp design mistakes aren't math mistakes, they're philosophy mistakes. Leaders make decisions about what to pay without first getting clear on what they're trying to drive. So let's start with the foundation. A CS comp plan is a communication tool. It tells your team in the clearest possible terms what a company values and what it's willing to pay for. 3 principles should underpin every CS comp plan that you design. The first principle is that comp must reflect responsibility. What your CSMs are paid on should map directly to what they actually own. So if they own retention, pay them on retention. If they own expansion, pay them on expansion. If they own both, the comp plan needs to reflect both. And the weighting between them should reflect the relative priority the company places on each. This sounds obvious. In practice, it's really where most plans go wrong. Paying CSMs for outcomes they don't fully control, or not paying them for outcomes they're directly driving. The second principle is that comp should drive behavior, not just reward outcomes. Outcomes are lagging. By the time a renewal lands or a churn event happens, the behavior that drove it has been in motion for months. Good comp design creates incentives that reward the leading behaviors like proactive account management, early risk surfacing, adoption driving, expansion identification, not just the lagging outcome of a number that closed. The third principle is that CS comp should never simply mirror sales comp. Sales comp is designed to drive new revenue acquisition. CS comp is designed to protect and grow existing revenue. Related but fundamentally different motions. The metrics, the cadence, and the structure, the work don't translate cleanly to customer success. And when CS leaders borrow the sales comp framework exactly as it is without adapting it, they create sales-like pressure without giving their team the sales-like authority and the tools to match. That's a recipe for frustration on all sides. With those principles in place, let's talk about how comp structure actually changes based on what your team owns. I want to use a framework I've developed through my work with customer success leaders to anchor this conversation, because the right comp structure isn't universal. It depends entirely on which revenue model your customer success team is operating under. There are 3 revenue-driven CS models: revenue protection, revenue enablement, and revenue ownership. Each one represents a different level of commercial responsibility for your CS team, and each one requires a different comp structure. So let me walk through each one. Revenue protection is the most focused model. The CSM's job here is pure retention. They ensure customers receive ongoing value and renew. All commercial conversations like renewals, pricing, expansion are handled by another role, typically an account manager or maybe sometimes a renewal manager. The CSM is not expected to identify expansion opportunities or close commercial conversations. Their world is value delivery and retention. Second is revenue enablement. It adds a layer. In this model, CSMs are still focused on retention, but they're also responsible for identifying expansion opportunities. The key word is identifying. They're not closing expansion deals. They're finding the signal, qualifying it, and passing it to sales for deal closure. This is the CSQL motion, or customer success qualified leads. The CSM spots the opportunity, surfaces, and then hands it off. And then the third model is revenue ownership. This is the most commercially complete model. CSMs fully own both retention and expansion. They're not just identifying opportunities, they're closing them. The expansion motion in this model can include upsells, cross sells, new business unit sales, or add on sales. The CSM owns the full revenue life cycle for their book of business. Now, understanding which model your team operates under is a starting point for everything else in comp design. Because the metrics that belong in a comp plan, the variable structure, and the base to variable split all flow from this answer. Let me get specific about base versus variable because this is where leaders make some of the most consequential decisions. The base salary represents the stable, non negotiable component of your CSM's compensation. It should reflect the market rate for the role, the segment that they're managing, and the level of seniority required. CS is not a sales role, and the base should be designed accordingly, competitive enough to attract and retain strong talent without creating artificial pressure to perform commercially in ways that the role may not fully support. The variable component, the portion tied to performance, is where the real comp design work happens. And the size of that variable pool relative to total comp should scale with the level of commercial responsibility the CSM carries. Here's how I think about it across the three models. In a revenue protection model, the CSM's commercial responsibility is focused entirely on retention. They're not identifying expansion, not closing deals, not carrying a full revenue number. The variable component in this model should be meaningful but not aggressive. So typically somewhere between 10 and 15% of total on target earnings or OTE. So if a CSM's OTE is, let's say, $100,000, the variable sits at 10 to 15. The philosophy here is that you want the plan to signal that performance matters, but the financial risk to the CSM should be proportionate to the commercial responsibility that they carry. A CSM who is purely focused on retention is not a salesperson, and their comp structure should reflect that. In the revenue enablement model, the CSM is doing more, right? They're identifying and qualifying expansion opportunities in addition to managing retention. That added responsibility warrants a larger variable component. In this model, I'd recommend a variable range of 15 to 25% of OTE. The increase reflects the added commercial contribution the CSM is making by servicing CSQL pipeline. So at 100,000 OTE, that's 15 to 25,000 in variable. Still not sales level variable, but meaningfully higher than pure protection to recognize the commercial contribution. And now, finally, in a revenue ownership model, the CSM fully owns retention and expansion. This is the closest CS gets to a sales motion, and the comp structure should reflect that. Variable in this model typically sits between 25 and 35% of OTE, sometimes higher in more commercially mature orgs where the CSM is running a full expansion motion with real quota accountability. At 100,000 OTE, that's 25 to 35,000 in variable. This is the model where accelerators make the most sense, where a CSM who exceeds their NRR target, for example, gets paid at an elevated rate on the overage, creating upside potential that rewards genuine commercial outperformance. I worked with a CS leader a while back whose team was running a full revenue ownership motion, managing the renewals, driving expansion, owning the commercial conversation end to end. But when you look at the comp plan, none of that was reflected. The variable was sitting at 12%, anchored almost entirely on the health score metric. No GRR component, no NRR, nothing that recognized the renewal and expansion accountability the team was actually carrying. And the impact was exactly what you'd expect. Her CSMs were doing the commercial work, but weren't being paid for it. The ones who were strong at renewals started to resent it. They were closing deals and earning a fraction of what that contribution warranted. A couple of her best people had already started looking externally because the comp didn't match the scope of the role. And the ones who weren't commercially strong had no financial incentive to develop those skills because the plan wasn't asking them to. We rebuilt their comp to reflect what the team was actually doing. GRR and NRR became the primary drivers. The variable moved to 30%. Accelerators went in above the NRR target. And we made the renewal accountability explicit in the plan, not just in the job description, but in what got paid. Within a quarter, the commercial conversations started changing, not because the CSM suddenly got better at renewals, because the comp plan finally acknowledged that renewals were their job. Okay, one more thing on base. As you scale and your CSM tiers become more defined, so you start having your scaled, your mid market, and your enterprise CSMs, the base should differentiate by tier as well. So, an enterprise CSM managing 5 million in ARR across, let's say, 10 accounts is doing a fundamentally different job from a scaled CSM managing 200 accounts at lower ARR. The comp bands should reflect that complexity difference. Enterprise CSMs command higher bases, higher OTEs, and often higher variable ceilings. And meanwhile, scaled CSMs have tighter bands, but higher account volume. Mid market sits in between, right? So if your comp plan treats all CSMs as interchangeable from a pay perspective, you're going to have retention problems at the enterprise tier and potentially overpayment problems at the scaled tier. Now, let's talk about how to weight that metrics inside that variable pool, because the variable percentage is only half the design. The other half is what you're actually paying for and in what proportion. In the revenue protection model, the primary driver of variable comp is GRR, or gross revenue retention. This should carry the majority of the variable weight, somewhere around, say, 60 to 70%. The remaining 30 to 40% can be split across leading indicators like adoption metrics, health score improvement, or time to value milestones that predict the GRR outcome and signal that the CSM is doing the work that leads to retention. The philosophy in this model is simple. Retention is the job. The majority of variable reflects that. The leading indicator component keeps the CSM focused on the behaviors that drive retention, rather than waiting passively for the renewal conversation to arrive. Let's look at the revenue enablement model. The variable structure expands to include the CSQL component. A reasonable weighting here looks like 50 to 60% on GRR, 20 to 30% on CSQL volume or pipeline value source, and 10 to 20% on an adoption or health metric. The introduction of the CSQL component signals clearly that identifying expansion is now part of the job, not an optional activity, not a nice to have, but something the CSM is financially accountable for. One design note worth flagging here: if you're introducing a CSQL metric for the first time, define the qualification criteria clearly before the plan goes live. A qualified CSQL should meet a specific threshold, like a customer contact who has expressed interest, or a business case that's been surfaced in conversation, or a deal size that meets a minimum threshold. I'm going to tell you, without clear criteria, CSMs will interpret qualification differently, and you're going to have conflict with sales over lead quality, and a metric will create more problems than it solves. And finally, in the revenue ownership model, the variable structure reflects full commercial accountability. So a typical weighting in this model sits around 40 to 50% on GRR, 40 to 50% on NRR or expansion revenue, and the remaining should be 10% on an adoption or health metric as a secondary. The near equal weighting between GRR and NRR reflects that in this model, retention and expansion are both core responsibilities. I'd recommend anchoring the GRR component slightly higher than expansion in most cases, even in a revenue ownership model, because the philosophy should be retention first, expansion second. A CSM who is chasing expansion at the expense of retention is optimizing for the wrong thing. And the weighting of your comp plan should make that priority clear before it becomes a behavioral problem. Accelerators belong in this model. When a CSM exceeds their NRR target, let's say their target is 100 NRR and they deliver 112%, they should earn at an elevated rate on the overage, typically 1.5 to 2 times the standard rate on performance above target. This creates meaningful upside for your strongest commercial performers and signals that expansion outperformance is genuinely valued. Remember this, your compound design isn't a one time decision because what makes sense at 5 million ARR is not what's going to make sense at 50 million. And one of the most common mistakes CS leaders make is leaving a comp structure in place long after the org has outgrown it. Your revenue model is a deliberate design choice. Based on experience, some orgs are built as revenue protection from day one and just stay there permanently. Some design CS as revenue ownership from the start. Others land in revenue enablement as the right long term model. And some do move across models over time. As the business evolves or as leadership decides, CS should carry more commercial accountability. Now, all of that is valid. What matters is that the choice is intentional and the comp plan reflects that clearly. What evolves as the org grows is the differentiation within the model. In early days, most CS teams are relatively homogeneous. Everyone is doing roughly the same job at the same tier. The comp plan can be relatively uniform. As the org matures and CSM tiers become defined, like you have your scaled, mid market, and enterprise, the structure needs to differentiate to reflect the different complexity, ARR responsibility, and commercial stakes of each tier. At scale, that differentiation becomes meaningful. Your enterprise CSM, for example, in a revenue ownership model, has a different comp band, a different variable ceiling, and a different accelerator threshold than your scaled CSM in the same model. Your mid market revenue enablement CSM has different CSQL targets than your enterprise counterpart. The structure reflects the reality of what each person owns and what achieving it requires at their tier. Now, one thing that should happen annually as well, regardless of where you are, is a benchmark review. Because CS comp benchmarks shift as the function matures and as the market for CS talent evolves, what was competitive 2 years ago may not be competitive today. So make sure you're benchmarking against the right cohort. Your growth stage, segment, and revenue model all affect what competitive looks like for you. And when the comp plan does need to change, because let's say the motion has evolved, because the tiers have differentiated, because the market has shifted, you have to communicate that clearly. Give your team enough lead time to prepare for the shift and make sure that any increase in commercial accountability is matched by an increase in enablement and support. Because changing the plan without changing the operating environment is going to set people up to fail financially. So you always make both moves together. Let's close the content with the most common comp mistakes I see in CS orgs and what each one signals to the team when it happens. The first mistake is paying CSMs on metrics they can control, tying comp to NPS when product gaps are driving the score, for example. Not paying CSMs on revenue generated when they are responsible for expansions. Holding CSMs financially accountable for outcomes that are downstream of decisions and dynamics entirely outside their influence. The signal this sends is we don't fully understand what you do, and we're holding you accountable for things that you can't change. Trust and leadership erodes quickly when this happens. The second mistake is changing the comp plan too frequently. Every time you change the plan, you're implicitly telling your team that the previous plan was wrong. I would say once a year is already a good enough cadence, which is aligned to annual planning cycles. And you have to make sure that you're communicating it clearly with enough lead time for the team to understand and adjust if there's a need to. More than that, and your team stops trusting the plan entirely, They're going to hedge. They're going to optimize for the short term because they don't believe the current structure will last. The third mistake is building a plan that nobody understands. A comp plan with too many components, too many modifiers, too many edge cases and exceptions loses its incentive effect entirely. 2 to 3 metrics maximum, clear hierarchy, and clear math that your team can do at the back of a napkin. Make it simple. The fourth mistake is setting targets that are too easy or too aggressive. Targets that are too easy get hit without driving the behaviors that you wanted. Meanwhile, targets that are too aggressive create resignation. CSM stop trying because the number feels unachievable and the variable feels unreachable. The right target is one where a solid, consistent performer hits it with good execution and a strong performer exceeds it with exceptional work. And the fifth mistake, and this one is the most damaging long term, is designing comp in isolation from the rest of the operating environment. A comp plan that pays for expansion but doesn't give CSMs the tools, the training, or the organizational support to run an expansion motion is setting people up for failure. Before you add a metric to a comp plan, ask yourself honestly, have I given my team everything they need to perform against this metric? If the answer is no, don't add the metric yet. Fix the environment first. The pattern I see most often across these mistakes is that they share a common root. The comp plan was designed quickly in reaction to something without stepping back to ask what behavior it was actually supposed to drive. Slowing down on that question before touching the structure is almost always worth it. Your comp plan is one of the loudest things you say to your team as a leader, louder than most of what you say in words, because it tells them what you value, what you trust them to own, and what kind of CS org you're building. Design it with the same intentionality you bring to your operating model, because the two are more connected than most people realize. Let's bring all of this together. First, start with philosophy. Comp must reflect responsibility, drive behavior, not just outcomes, and never simply mirror a sales structure. Get clear on what you're trying to incentivize before you pick a single metric or set a single number. Second, anchor your comp design in your revenue model and let the model dictate both the variable range and the metric weighting. The commercial responsibilities your CSMs carried should be directly visible in both numbers. Third, keep the metric structure simple and hierarchical, 2 to 3 metrics maximum with clear priority between them. If your CSMs can calculate their own comp mid-quarter, the plan isn't going to drive behavior. Fourth, differentiate by tier. Enterprise CSMs carry higher bases and higher OTEs than skilled CSMs. The comp band should reflect the complexity and commercial stakes of each tier. Fifth, evolve the plan as the org scales. Simple and retention-focused early stage, revenue enablement structure as the expansion identification motion matures, full revenue ownership structure at scale with differentiated tiers and accelerators. And 6, avoid the common mistakes. Don't pay for what your team can control. Don't change the plan too often. It's simple enough that your CSMs can do the math themselves. Set targets in the zone where solid execution hits and strong performance exceeds. And don't add a metric before you've given the team what they need to perform against it. Comp plan design is one of those decisions where the knowledge of what to do isn't the hard part. The hard part is the judgment. First, which revenue model actually fits your org? Then, how to weigh competing priorities, how to make the transition from one structure to another without breaking team trust in the process. Those calls are always specific to your situation, and they're almost impossible to get right in the abstract. If you're working through a comp redesign right now and want to think in partner to pressure test the structure, the weightings, and the sequencing, that's exactly the kind of work I do in my one-on-one executive coaching. If that's where you are, head on over to csrevspeak.com/coaching and schedule a consult call. I'd love to work through it with you. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.